Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. Edward here, so happy you're with me. Before we start, tell me, do you prefer listening to our mysteries late at night, early in the morning, or during a quiet afternoon moment? Your answers always warm my heart. And do subscribe so you never miss a story. Now, settle in. It's time for tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. A Lonely Christmas in Lochdub. The village of Lochdub lay wrapped in frost and fairy lights like a child's snow globe, pretty and perfect and utterly deceptive. Hamish Macbeth, the local police constable, stood at his kitchen window watching the December darkness settle over the loch, his dog-lugs snoring gently at his feet. He should have been feeling the Christmas spirit, he told himself severely. The village was doing its best. Coloured lights twinkled from cottage windows, wreaths of holly hung on doors, and someone had even attempted to string lights on the war memorial, though they hung at a drunken angle that suggested Archie MacLean had been involved. But Hamish felt the familiar melancholy that often accompanied the festive season. Christmas in the Highlands could be a lonely business if you let it. He thought of his family gathered in Rogart without him, of promotion opportunities he'd deliberately fumbled to stay in this peaceful backwater, and wondered, not for the first time, if he was a fool. Lugs opened one eye and regarded him with what Hamish could have sworn was sympathy. "Aye, well," Hamish said to the dog, "at least I've got you, and you're better company than most." The wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the scent of peat smoke and the promise of snow. Hamish pulled on his regulation jacket and peaked cap, more out of habit than necessity. On a quiet Christmas Eve morning, Lochdub was hardly a hotbed of criminal activity. His rounds would take him past the cottages strung along the waterfront, up the brae to the Napoli restaurant where Willie Lamont would be frantically polishing everything in sight, and perhaps a stop at Patel's for the newspapers. He stepped out into the crisp morning, lugs padding faithfully behind him. The village was still quiet, though smoke rose from chimneys and he could hear the faint sound of carols from the Curry sisters' cottage. Those Spencer twins would be preparing for their annual Christmas tea, an event that was more endurance test than celebration. It was as Hamish walked along the harbour front that he noticed it. Mrs. Elspeth Cameron's cottage, tucked between the Sutherlands and the Old Manse, stood dark and unadorned. No lights, no wreath, no sign of Christmas cheer whatsoever. The window stared blankly at the street like closed eyes. Hamish frowned. Elspeth Cameron was a quiet woman, true enough. She'd moved to Lochdub 3 years back, a widow in her late 60s with a preference for keeping herself to herself. But surely even she would have managed a bit of decoration. The sight of that dark cottage struck him as profoundly sad, a small surrender to loneliness. He was still pondering this when he met the postman, Jock Kennedy, hurrying toward him with an expression of distress on his weathered face. "Hamish! Thank the Lord, you'd better come quick. It's Mrs. Cameron." Hamish's heart sank. What's happened? "I was delivering her post, you see, and the door was unlocked. I called out, got no answer, so I stepped inside just to check and there she is, sitting by the fire as peaceful as you please, but—" Jock swallowed hard. "She's dead, Hamish. Stone dead." They hurried back to the cottage, Lugs trotting alongside with his ears pricked forward. The front door stood ajar, and Hamish pushed it open carefully, calling out even though he knew it was futile. The cottage was immaculate inside, almost obsessively tidy. Everything in its place, cushions plumped, surfaces gleaming. A small artificial Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with precision but no joy, and on the table sat a neat stack of wrapped presents, their tags written in careful script. In an armchair by the fireplace sat Mrs. Elspeth Cameron, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed. She looked for all the world as if she had simply fallen asleep. A half-finished glass of sherry stood on the side table beside her, and the remains of a peat fire glowed dimly in the grate. Hamish felt for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. The skin was cool, the body stiff. She'd been dead for hours. "Should I call Dr. Brodie?" Jock asked nervously. "Dr. Dalrymple's covering for him while he's away," Hamish said absently, studying the scene. Something about it bothered him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. It was all too tidy, too peaceful, too perfect. Aye, give her a call. A flurry of movement at the door announced the arrival of Mrs. Morag Sutherland, Elspeth's next-door neighbour. She was a handsome woman in her early 60s, with iron-grey hair and the capable air of someone who knew how to manage a crisis. "Oh dear God," she breathed, taking in the scene. "Not Elspeth. I was just here yesterday evening checking on her. She seemed fine, a bit tired perhaps, but fine." "You've been looking after her?" Hamish asked. "Someone had to," Morag said, her voice catching. "She had no family, poor soul. I've been popping in daily, making sure she had proper meals, keeping her company. She was lonely, Hamish, though she'd never admit it." There was genuine distress in Morag's voice, and tears in her eyes. Yet Hamish noticed how quickly she composed herself, how efficiently she moved to check the fire, to straighten a cushion, to touch Elspeth's shoulder with a gentle, familiar gesture. "Did she have any health problems you knew of?" Hamish asked. "Not that she mentioned, but you know how these older folk can be, keeping things to themselves. Perhaps her heart just gave out. It happens, especially at Christmas." Morag's voice was soft with sympathy. "All alone on Christmas Eve, it's a terrible thing." Dr. Jennifer Dalrymple arrived within the hour, a brisk young woman who'd recently joined the practice. She conducted her examination while Hamish waited outside with Morag, who insisted on making tea for everyone, finding her way around Elspeth's kitchen with the ease of long familiarity. When Dr. Dalrymple emerged, her expression was thoughtful. "Natural causes?" Hamish asked. "That would be the obvious conclusion," she said carefully. "But I'd like to do a more thorough examination. There's something—" she hesitated. "It's probably nothing. The woman was 68 after all, but she was in remarkably good health for her age. No heart disease, blood pressure normal last time she came in. I'd like to be certain." Hamish nodded slowly, his unease growing. He looked back at the cottage, at its dark windows and closed door, and thought of Elspeth Cameron sitting alone by her fire on Christmas Eve, sipping sherry in the perfect stillness. Too perfect, he thought again. Much too perfect. And as snow began to fall softly over Loch-Dub, Hamish Macbeth had the uncomfortable feeling that this Christmas was going to be anything but peaceful. Chapter 2. A Death That Feels Too Tidy. By late afternoon, the snow had settled over Loch-Dub like a benediction, softening the harsh lines of the cottages and muffling the usual sounds of village life. Hamish stood in Elspeth Cameron's sitting room, watching Dr. Dalrymple complete her second examination of the body. The cottage had taken on the eerie quality of a stage set, everything in place, waiting for actors who would never arrive. "Well?" he asked when she finally straightened up. Dalrymple stripped off her gloves with a snap. "I'm sending samples for toxicology. There's nothing obvious, but my instincts are telling me something's off. The body temperature, the rigor mortis, the general presentation. She died sometime between 8 and midnight last night, I'd estimate. But no signs of violence. None whatsoever. If this is anything other than natural causes, it's subtle." She glanced around the room with a frown. "Though I'll say this much, Hamish, I've seen a fair few deaths in my time, and there's usually some sign of distress. A knocked-over glass, a cushion on the floor, something. This looks staged." Hamish had been thinking the same thing. Aye, like a painting of someone dying peacefully. After Dr. Dalrymple left, Hamish began a methodical search of the cottage. Morag Sutherland had offered to help, but he gently declined, suggesting she go home and rest. She'd looked almost reluctant to leave, hovering by the door with offers of assistance until he'd all but shooed her out. The sitting room told him little beyond what he already knew. The presents on the table were wrapped in expensive paper, each tag written in the same careful hand. One for the Curry sisters, one for Patel, one for the minister. Gifts for acquaintances, not friends. Nothing personal, nothing intimate. The kitchen was spotless, every surface gleaming, every dish in its place. The refrigerator contained precisely labelled containers of what looked like home-cooked meals. Hamish lifted one lid and sniffed. Cottage pie, rich and fragrant. He checked the others. Soup, stew, a casserole. Enough food for a week, all fresh. Morag's been busy, he murmured to Luggs, who had his nose pressed hopefully against the refrigerator door. In the bathroom cabinet, he found the usual assortment of medications for a woman of Elspeth's age. Nothing unusual, blood pressure tablets, vitamin supplements, paracetamol, all prescribed by Dr. Brodie, all current. It was in the bedroom that things became interesting. The room was as tidy as the rest of the house. The bed made with hospital corners, the dressing table arranged with mathematical precision. But when Hamish knelt to look under the bed, his hand brushed against something solid. A suitcase, old-fashioned, battered, pushed far back against the wall. It was locked. Hamish sat back on his heels, studying it. Most people kept suitcases in cupboards or the attic. This had been deliberately hidden. He fetched a screwdriver from his police Land Rover and worked the lock until it clicked open. Inside was a life that didn't match the quiet widow of Loch-Dubh. Newspaper clippings, yellowed with age, all from Glasgow papers. Court reports mainly. A fraud case from 30 years ago involving a property development scheme. Several men had gone to prison, and there, in the witness list, a name jumped out at him. Margaret Fraser. Hamish spread the clippings on the bed, piecing together the story. Margaret Fraser had been a secretary at the firm, had turned prosecution witness, testified against her employers in exchange for leniency. She'd received a suspended sentence while the others had gone down for 5 to 10 years each. There were photographs too, a younger Elspeth, though the bone structure was the same, standing outside a courthouse, and another, older still, of her with a man. He was perhaps 40, dark-haired and serious, his arm around her shoulders. On the back in faded ink, M. & James, Loch Lomond, 1978. At the bottom of the suitcase lay legal documents, a deed poll changing Margaret Fraser's name to Elspeth Cameron, a death certificate for one James Cameron killed in a car accident in 1995, insurance papers, bank statements showing a substantial sum of money carefully managed over the years. "Well, well," Hamish said softly. "What were you running from, Mrs. Cameron? Or should I say Mrs. Fraser?" A knock at the door made him start. He closed the suitcase and went to answer it, finding Morag Sutherland on the doorstep, a covered dish in her hands. "I thought you might be hungry," she said with a smile that was both warm and somehow practised. "I know you bachelors don't look after yourselves properly." "That's kind of you, Mrs. Sutherland, but please call me Morag. And it's no trouble at all. I had the stew on anyway." She peered past him into the cottage. "Have you found anything? Any idea what might have happened to poor Elspeth?" There was something in her eyes, a sharpness that belied the gentle concern in her voice. Hamish found himself choosing his words carefully. "Dr. Dalrymple's sending off some tests. We'll know more in a few days." "Tests? You don't think there was anything suspicious?" Morag's hand went to her throat. "Surely not in Loch-Dubh. We're all friends here." "Just routine," Hamish assured her, though he was watching her reaction closely. "Tell me, how long had you been helping Mrs. Cameron?" "Oh, about 6 months or so. She seemed to be struggling a bit, you know how it is. I lost my own husband 5 years ago, so I understand what it's like, being alone." Morag's eyes grew misty. "I'd bring her meals, sit with her in the evening sometimes. She seemed grateful for the company, though she never said much about herself." "Did she ever mention family? Friends from before she came here?" "Never. I always had the impression she was running from something, a bad marriage perhaps, or family troubles. She changed the subject whenever I asked about her past." Morag shifted the dish in her hands. She did seem happier these last few weeks, though, almost excited about something. I thought perhaps she was finally settling in, accepting Loch-Dubh as home. After Morag left, Hamish stood at the window, watching her hurry back to her own cottage through the falling snow. She was a helpful neighbour, concerned and caring. So why did he have the nagging feeling that her kindness was a performance? He returned to the bedroom and examined the suitcase's contents again. Margaret Fraser had committed a crime, betrayed her colleagues, and built a new life under a false name. She'd lived quietly in Loughdube for 3 years, keeping her secrets, accepting Morag's help and the village's casual friendliness without ever truly letting anyone in. And now she was dead, sitting peacefully by her fire with a glass of sherry, surrounded by wrapped presents she'd never deliver. The telephone rang, making him jump. It was Blair from Strathbane, drunk and belligerent as usual. "Macbeth, what's this I hear about a death in your wee village? Natural causes, I hope. We don't need any complications right before Christmas." "Looks that way, sir," Hamish lied smoothly. "Old woman. Lived alone. Heart probably gave out." "Good, good. Keep it simple, Macbeth. File the report and close it. I don't want any of your nonsense about murder in the Highlands." After he hung up, Hamish smiled grimly. Blair's laziness was sometimes useful. It meant he could investigate properly without interference from Strathbane. He locked up the cottage and headed back to the police station with lugs. The village was quiet now, most people indoors preparing for Christmas Eve supper. Lights glowed golden in windows, and he could hear singing from the church where they were rehearsing carols. It all looked so innocent, so peaceful, but Hamish had learned long ago that appearances in the Highlands could be deceiving. Beneath the surface of this pretty village, old sins had a way of festering, old grievances of finding their moment. Margaret Fraser had thought she could escape her past by becoming Elspeth Cameron. She'd been wrong, and someone in Loughdube knew it. Chapter 3. The Widow's Quiet Past. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright over Loughdube, the kind of day that made tourists rhapsodise about the Highlands and made locals grumble about having to trudge through snow to church. Hamish stood in his kitchen making porridge, his mind turning over the puzzle of Elspeth Cameron like a Rubik's cube that refused to align. Lug sat at his feet, radiating hope and patience in equal measure. "No, you cannot have bacon," Hamish told him. "It's Christmas, not a miracle." The dog sighed heavily, a sound of deep existential suffering that would have done credit to a Shakespearean actor. Despite Blair's instructions to close the case, Hamish knew he couldn't let it rest. A woman didn't hide her entire past in a locked suitcase if she didn't have something to fear. And fear, in Hamish's experience, usually preceded violence. After breakfast, he made his way to the church, where the Christmas service was already underway. He slipped into the back pew and let his gaze wander over the congregation. Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, was singing with the enthusiasm, if not the tune. The Curry sisters sat ramrod straight, their matching hats adorned with sprigs of holly. Archie McLean was clearly nursing a hangover, his face the colour of old porridge. And there was Morag Sutherland, sitting alone near the front, her head bowed in what appeared to be prayer. She looked the picture of a respectable grief, dressed in black, a handkerchief clutched in one hand. After the service, Hamish positioned himself near the church door, accepting Christmas wishes from the villagers as they filed out. It was Jessie Curry who gave him his first useful piece of information, though she didn't realise it. "Terrible business about Mrs. Cameron," she said, her sister Nessie echoing her words a beat behind as always, "though I must say, I'm not entirely surprised." "Not surprised," Nessie repeated. "Oh?" Hamish kept his tone casual. "Why's that?" Jessie leaned in, lowering her voice to what she probably thought was a whisper, but which carried easily across the churchyard. "She had a telephone call last month. I happened to be passing, you understand, and I heard her through the window. She was quite upset, telling someone to leave her alone, that she'd paid her debt already." "Her debt," Nessie confirmed. "Do you hear anything else?" "Well, I wasn't eavesdropping," Jessie said, with magnificent hypocrisy. "But I did hear her say something about it all being in the past, and that person should let it stay there. Then she saw me and shut the window quite firmly." "Quite firmly," Nessie agreed. After extracting himself from the Curry sisters, Hamish found Archie McLean smoking behind the church, looking as if he wished the ground would swallow him whole. "Rough night?" Hamish asked sympathetically. "The Hogmanay celebration started early at the pub," Archie admitted. "I'm paying for it now. What's this about?" "Elspeth Cameron, then? Morag's been telling everyone how peaceful she looked. sitting by her fire. You knew Mrs. Cameron well? Not well, no. She kept herself to herself. I'd see her at Patel's sometimes, always very polite but never chatty, if you know what I mean. Archie lit another cigarette with shaking hands. I did think it was odd, though. What was? About 6 months back, we were having a committee meeting at the hall trying to organise the summer fete. Angela Brodie suggested we ask Mrs. Cameron to help, seeing as she'd made a generous donation. But when Angela went to ask her, the woman turned white as a sheet and refused point blank. Said she didn't do committees, didn't do public events, wanted nothing to do with it. That's not so unusual, Hamish said. Plenty of folk don't like committees. Aye. But it was the way she said it, like she was frightened. Angela said she looked hunted. Archie ground out his cigarette. And yet she donated £200. Strange that. Wanting to help, but not wanting to be seen helping. Hamish filed this away and continued his rounds. At the Napoli, Willie Lamont was polishing glasses with his usual manic intensity. The restaurant closed for the holiday, but Willie unable to rest. Hamish, Merry Christmas. Have you come for your dinner? I've saved you a portion of turkey. That's kind, Willie. Tell me, did you ever speak to Mrs. Cameron? Willie's face grew thoughtful. Once or twice when she came in for takeaway. She always seemed nervous, looking over her shoulder like she expected someone to grab her. I thought maybe she'd been in an abusive relationship before, you know. Some women never really recover from that. Did she ever mention where she had lived before Lochdupe? Never, and I asked, being friendly-like. She just said somewhere down south and changed the subject quick smart. Willie picked up another glass and began polishing. Morag would know more. She spent a lot of time with her these past months. That was the second time someone had mentioned the 6-month mark. Hamish made a mental note to find out exactly when Morag's attention to Elspeth had begun. He spent the afternoon at the police station, going through what little information he had. The newspaper clippings from the suitcase told him that Margaret Fraser had been 38 when she testified, which would make her 68 now. The age matched. The fraud case had involved a property development scheme in Glasgow's East End, a scam that had cost ordinary people their life savings. Hamish put in a call to an old colleague in Glasgow asking for any additional information on the case and its principals. Then he sat back and waited, watching the light fade over the loch. It was nearly 6 when his phone rang. Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, sounding weary but alert. Hamish, you old devil, what are you stirring up on Christmas Day? Just following a thread, Jimmy. What did you find? The Fraser case was a nasty bit of business. 5 men went down, sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years. The ringleader was a man named Donald Lennox. He got 12, died in prison 8 years ago. Heart attack. Hamish sat up straighter. Lennox? Any family? A wife, Moira, and a brother, Callum Fraser. Moira disappeared after the trial, never heard from again. Callum did his time, got out and dropped off the radar about 10 years back. No known address, no employment records, nothing. And Margaret Fraser? She got a suspended sentence and vanished. The prosecution lost track of her within a year. Smart woman, apparently. She knew those men would come looking for revenge once they got out. After hanging up, Hamish sat in the gathering darkness, the pieces beginning to align in his mind. Morag Sutherland, Moira Lennox. The names were similar enough that a woman wanting to hide but not completely reinvent herself might choose one over the other. He pulled out the electoral register and checked. Morag Sutherland had registered in Lochdupe 5 years ago, shortly after her supposed husband's death. No previous address listed, claiming she'd been living abroad, and she'd befriended Elspeth Cameron 6 months ago. Hamish stood and paced the small station, lugs watching him with interest. If Morag was Moira Lennox, if she'd somehow tracked down the woman who'd sent her husband to prison, what then? Revenge seemed the obvious answer. But why wait? Why the months of friendship, the helpful meals, the concerned visits? Unless she'd been biding her time, winning Elspeth's trust, getting close enough to strike without suspicion. He needed more evidence, something concrete. The toxicology report wouldn't be back for days, and even then it might show nothing. He needed to search Morag's cottage, but he had no grounds for a warrant. Blair would laugh him out of Strathbane if he suggested it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Angela Brodie, Dr. Brodie's wife, carrying a plate covered with foil. "Merry Christmas, Hamish. I thought you might be alone and hungry." "You're very kind, Angela." She hesitated on the doorstep. "I heard about Elspeth Cameron. Such a sad thing. I keep thinking I should have tried harder to include her in village life." "You couldn't have known." "I suppose not. But I had such an odd feeling about her. She reminded me of someone, though I could never place who." Angela shook her head. "I saw her photograph in the Strathbane Gazette once, years ago, I'm sure of it. But when I mentioned it, she became quite agitated and denied ever being in the papers." "When was this?" "About a year after she arrived. I let it drop, of course. Everyone's entitled to their privacy." Angela smiled sadly. "I wish I'd tried harder now. Maybe if she'd had friends, she wouldn't have died alone." After Angela left, Hamish unwrapped the plate to find roast turkey, stuffing and all the trimmings. He ate, mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Elspeth Cameron, formerly Margaret Fraser, had lived in Loch for 3 years. Morag Sutherland, possibly Moira Lennox, had arrived 2 years earlier. She would have recognised Elspeth eventually, perhaps seen her in the village, confirmed her identity, and then what? Waited, planned, befriended, and when Elspeth let her guard down, when she accepted the meals and the company and the kindness Morag had struck, if his theory was correct. Hamish looked out at the dark village, at the lights twinkling in cottage windows, at the peaceful Highland scene that masked something ugly beneath its surface. Tomorrow, he decided, he would pay a visit to Morag Sutherland, a friendly, casual visit, the kind neighbours made on Boxing Day, and he would watch very carefully for any crack in her performance. Chapter 4. Christmas visitors and old wounds. Boxing Day brought a thaw, the snow melting into slush that made the streets of Loch treacherous and turned the villagers' moods sour. Hamish was contemplating his planned visit to Morag Sutherland when 2 unexpected arrivals made the decision for him. The first was a man in his mid-50s who pulled up to the police station in a rental car that had seen better days. He was thin to the point of gauntness, with receding hair and the pinched expression of someone nursing a permanent grievance. He climbed out of the car and stood for a moment, staring at Elspeth Cameron's cottage with an intensity that made Hamish's instincts prickle. "Can I help you?" Hamish asked, stepping out to meet him. The man turned, and Hamish saw eyes that were hard with old anger. "I'm looking for Elspeth Cameron. I'm told this is her house." "And you are?" "Callum Fraser, her nephew." The words came out bitter. "Though she'd have denied the relationship if you'd asked her. Where is she?" Hamish studied him carefully. "I'm afraid I have bad news, Mr. Fraser. Mrs. Cameron passed away on Christmas Eve." For a moment, something like shock crossed Callum's face, followed quickly by what looked almost like satisfaction. "Dead, is she? Well, well. I suppose even traitors run out of luck eventually." "That's a harsh thing to say about your aunt." "Aunt?" Callum laughed, a sound devoid of humour. "She was no aunt of mine. My mother was her sister, God rest her soul, though Elspeth never acknowledged the connection. Too busy saving her own skin to care about the family she destroyed." "Perhaps we should talk inside," Hamish suggested, aware of curtains twitching in nearby windows. In the police station, Callum accepted tea but refused biscuits, sitting rigidly in the chair as if relaxation would be a betrayal of his anger. "When did you arrive in Loch Dubh?" Hamish asked. "Yesterday afternoon. Drove up from Glasgow. I've been trying to reach her for weeks, but she never answered her phone. I should have known she'd find a way to escape one last time." "Escape what?" Callum's jaw tightened. "Justice. Accountability. Call it what you like. That woman testified against my father 30 years ago. Sent him to prison for 12 years over a property deal that was no more crooked than half the schemes in Glasgow at the time. The fraud case, Hamish said. I've read about it. Then you know she walked away with barely a slap on the wrist while good men rotted in cells. Callum's hands clenched into fists. My father died in prison. Heart attack, they said. More like a broken heart. And my mother never recovered. She died 5 years ago, still waiting for an apology that never came. Is that why you came here? For an apology? I came to tell her what I thought of her, to make sure she knew the damage she'd caused. Callum's voice dropped. But I suppose death got to her first. How did it happen? We're still investigating, Hamish said carefully. When exactly did you arrive in Loch? I told you, yesterday afternoon around 4, drove straight to her cottage, but there was police tape on the door and a constable who wouldn't let me in. He met Hamish's gaze squarely. If you're thinking I had something to do with her death, you're wrong. I wanted her alive. I wanted her to face what she had done. After Callum left, checking into the Tommelcastle Hotel with the air of a man settling in for a siege, Hamish sat pondering this new development. The nephew's arrival after Elspeth's death seemed almost too convenient, but his anger had the ring of authenticity, unless he was a very good actor. The second visitor arrived an hour later, a contrast in every way to Callum Fraser. Fiona Grant was perhaps 40, well-dressed in expensive coat and boots, with this kind of purposeful energy that marked her as someone from the city. She introduced herself as a charity worker from Inverness, and asked to speak with whoever was handling Elspeth Cameron's estate. That would be her solicitor in Strathbane, Hamish told her. Might I ask why? Fiona's face softened, with what appeared to be genuine sadness. I've been working with Mrs. Cameron for the past 2 months on a substantial donation to our charity. We help victims of financial fraud rebuild their lives. She was going to give us £50,000, Hamish whistled softly. That's generous. It was more than generous. It was redemptive. Fiona pulled out a chair without being asked and sat down, her composure wavering. Mrs. Cameron contacted us in October. She said she wanted to make amends for something in her past, though she wouldn't specify what. We had several meetings, and she seemed determined to go through with it. The donation was to be finalised after Christmas. Did she seem ill? Worried about anything? Not ill, no, but definitely troubled. At our last meeting just before Christmas, she seemed almost relieved, as if she'd made a difficult decision. She said something odd. Fiona frowned, trying to remember. She said, "It's time to stop hiding. Whatever happens, at least I'll have done one thing right." Whatever happens, Hamish repeated. That's an interesting phrase. I thought so too. I asked if she was in some kind of trouble, if there was anything I could do to help, but she just smiled and said the only help she needed was knowing the money would go to people who'd been hurt the way she'd once hurt others. Fiona's eyes glistened. I had the sense she was trying to buy forgiveness for something terrible. After Fiona departed, leaving her contact details and a request to be informed about the donation's status, Hamish walked to Elspeth's cottage. The scene of crime tape was still up, but he had the keys. Inside, everything remained as it had been, frozen in that unsettling perfection. He stood in the sitting room trying to piece together the timeline. Elspeth had been planning a major donation, possibly planning to confess her past publicly. The comment about stopping hiding suggested she'd grown tired of looking over her shoulder, but something had stopped her before she could complete that redemption. Someone had stopped her. The door opened behind him, and Morag Sutherland stepped in, her face etched with concern. "Hamish, I saw you come in. I hope you don't mind, but I have a key. Elspeth gave it to me months ago." She glanced around the room with apparent sorrow. "I've been thinking about her constantly. Such a lonely end." "Not entirely lonely," Hamish said. "She had you." For what little comfort that was. Morag moved to the mantelpiece, straightening a photograph that didn't need straightening. "I've been thinking, Hamish, about those last few weeks. She did seem different, almost excited, but nervous too. She kept saying she had important things to do, decisions to make." "Did she mention what kind of decisions?" "No, and I didn't pry. I respected her privacy. Morag turned to face him, her expression earnest. But I wonder now if she was ill, if she knew something was wrong with her heart and didn't tell anyone. Maybe she was putting her affairs in order. That's possible, Hamish said, watching her carefully, though Dr. Dalrymple said she was in excellent health. Doctors can miss things, Morag sighed. I suppose we'll never really know what was in her mind those last days. She kept so much to herself. Aye, she did. Tell me, Morag, did you know Mrs. Cameron before she came to Loughdub? The question hung in the air for a moment too long. Morag's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Before? No, of course not. I'd never met her until she moved here. Why would you ask that? Just eliminating possibilities. Someone told me she looked familiar. Wondered if she had lived in these parts before. Not that she ever mentioned to me. Morag moved toward the door. I should let you get on with your work. Will you be much longer? I'd like to clean the place, make it presentable for whoever inherits. Best to leave it as is for now, Hamish said. Police procedure. After she left, he stood at the window watching her cross to her own cottage. Her movements were quick, almost agitated, and she glanced back at Elspeth's house twice before disappearing inside. Hamish pulled out his phone and dialed Jimmy Anderson again. I need you to check something for me, Jimmy. A woman named Morag Sutherland, currently residing in Loughdub. See if there's any connection to Moira Lennox, wife of Donald Lennox from the Fraser fraud case. You think your helpful neighbour is the dead man's widow? I think my helpful neighbour is lying about something, and in a case like this, lies usually mean murder. As he locked up the cottage and headed back to the station, Hamish couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Morag had been too quick to suggest natural causes, too eager to clean and tidy and remove any trace of what had happened. She was a woman covering her tracks, and Hamish meant to uncover every single one of them. Chapter 5, Motives Under the Mistletoe. The call from Dr. Dalrymple came early the next morning, before Hamish had finished his first cup of coffee. Her voice was tight with professional concern. The toxicology results are back, Hamish. Elspeth Cameron didn't die of natural causes. She was poisoned. Hamish set down his mug carefully. What kind of poison? Temazepam. It's a benzodiazepine, a sleeping medication. Someone dissolved a massive dose in that sherry, enough to ensure she'd never wake up. Given her age and the fact she'd been drinking alcohol, it would have worked quickly. She'd have felt drowsy, drifted off, and that would have been it. How long would it take? 20 minutes to half an hour, perhaps less. And here's the thing, Hamish. The dose was so high this wasn't an accident. Someone meant to kill her. After hanging up, Hamish sat in the quiet kitchen, Lugs watching him with sympathetic brown eyes. Murder, then. Not a surprise, given everything he'd learned. But now it was official. Now he could stop tiptoeing around Blair's instructions and conduct a proper investigation. He telephoned Strathbane and left a message for Blair, knowing full well the Detective Chief Inspector would be nursing a post-holiday hangover and unlikely to surface before noon. Then he made a list of everyone who'd had opportunity and motive. Morag Sutherland topped the list. She'd had access to the house, had been preparing Elspeth's meals and drinks, and if she was indeed Moira Lennox, she had 30 years of grievance burning in her chest. But Hamish had learned long ago not to jump to conclusions, no matter how obvious they seemed. Callum Fraser claimed he'd arrived after Elspeth's death, but Hamish had only his word for that. The hotel could confirm when he checked in, but he might have been in the area earlier. And his bitterness toward his aunt was palpable. Fiona Grant had seemed genuinely distressed, but £50,000 was a powerful motive. If the charity was in financial trouble, as Hamish suspected, might someone have decided to silence Elspeth before she could discover any irregularities? And then there was the matter of the sleeping pills themselves. Where had they come from? Hamish pulled on his jacket and headed out into the cold morning. His first stop was Morag's cottage, where he found her in the garden, scattering seeds for the birds despite the damp chill. "Hamish, have you had breakfast? I've got fresh scones." The offer was made with such warmth that Hamish felt a twinge of doubt about his suspicions. But he'd known murderers who could smile while planning their next kill. "Just a quick word, Morag. I'm trying to trace everyone's movements on Christmas Eve. For the official report, you understand." "Of course." She led him inside to a kitchen that smelled of baking and was as tidy as Elspeth's had been. "I was here all evening, made myself a small supper, watched the telly, went to bed early. Alone, I'm afraid, so I can't prove any of it." "And you last saw Mrs. Cameron when?" "Around 6 in the evening. I brought her supper, a nice cottage pie. We chatted for a bit, and she seemed in good spirits. I offered to stay, but she said she was tired and wanted an early night." Morag's eyes filled with tears. If only I'd insisted. Maybe if someone had been with her. "Did you prepare her sherry?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended. Morag blinked. "Her sherry? No, she always poured her own. She had a particular ritual about it, said it helped her relax before bed." "Why do you ask?" "Just routine questions." Hamish glanced around the kitchen, noting the medication bottles lined up precisely on the windowsill. "Do you take sleeping tablets, Morag?" Her hand went to her throat. "I did, after my husband died. Terrible insomnia. But I haven't used them in years. Why?" "May I see them?" She hesitated, then fetched a bottle from the cupboard. "Temazepam prescribed 5 years ago to Moira Sutherland." The name hit Hamish like a punch, not even bothering to hide it. "Moira," he said quietly. "Your prescription says Moira." The colour drained from her face. For a long moment she stood frozen, the bottle clutched in her hand. Then she sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "It's my middle name," she said finally. "I've always gone by it with doctors. Silly, really, but Morag seemed too Scottish for official papers when I lived in England." "Did you now? When was that?" "Years ago, after my husband died." Her voice had gone flat, defensive. "I moved around quite a bit before settling here. Is there a problem, Hamish? How many pills are left in that bottle?" She opened it with shaking hands and counted. 15, I told you, I don't use them anymore. "And you're sure about that? You didn't perhaps offer one to Mrs. Cameron when she complained of not sleeping well?" "She never complained about sleep." Morag's eyes widened with understanding. "My God! You think someone gave her sleeping pills? You think she was murdered?" Her shock seemed genuine, but Hamish had learned that the best liars were those who believe their own performances. He took the bottle, promising to return it, and left her sitting at her kitchen table looking stunned. His next stop was the Tommel Castle Hotel, where he found Callum Fraser eating a solitary breakfast in the dining room. The man looked as if he hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed and his hands unsteady. "Mr. Fraser, I need to verify your movements on Christmas Eve." Callum laughed bitterly. "I wondered when you'd get around to thinking I killed her. The angry nephew seeking revenge. It's almost poetic." "I'm just gathering information." "I was in Glasgow until late afternoon on the 24th. Drove up the A9, stopped for petrol in Perth around 7, got lost twice trying to find this godforsaken village, and arrived around 9:30 to find the place swarming with police and my dear aunt already dead." He pushed his plate away. "I have receipts if you need them, and I'm sure the petrol station has CCTV. "Did you know anyone in Lochduba before you came here?" "Not a soul. This was my first and, God willing, last visit." Callum met his gaze. "I won't pretend I'm sorry she's dead, Constable, but I didn't kill her. I wanted to see her face when I told her what her testimony had cost my family. Death robbed me of that satisfaction." Back at the station, Hamish called Fiona Grant in Inverness. Her voice was crisp and professional when she answered. "Miss Grant, I need to ask you about your whereabouts on Christmas Eve." "At home, Constable. I live alone, spent the evening wrapping presents for my nieces and nephews. Hardly exciting, but there you are." "Can anyone confirm that?" "I spoke to my sister on the phone around 8, called to wish her family a happy Christmas." There was a pause. "Is this about the donation? Has something happened?" "We're investigating Mrs. Cameron's death more thoroughly. Can you tell me about the financial state of your charity?" The silence stretched out for several beats too long. "We've had some difficulties," Fiona admitted finally. "Nothing serious, but our accounts have been flagged for review. Some discrepancies that I'm sure can be explained. Mrs. Cameron knew about it. I was completely honest with her. And she still wanted to proceed with the donation. She said she understood that mistakes happen and that she believed in second chances." Fiona's voice caught. She said she'd made terrible mistakes herself and wanted to help others recover from theirs. "That's why this donation was so important, Constable. It wasn't just about the money, it was about her finding peace." After the call ended, Hamish added another name to his list: Angus McPhee, the local handyman. According to village gossip, he'd done some work for Elspeth recently, and there had been words about payment. He found Angus at the pub, nursing a pint and looking aggrieved. I did some repairs on a cottage," Angus confirmed. "Fixed the roof, painted the spare bedroom, but she paid me fair and square, every penny. I don't know where you heard otherwise. You didn't have an argument?" "Well, we had words about the colour of the paint. She wanted magnolia. I thought cream would be better, but we settled it amicably enough." Angus took a long drink. "And before you ask, I was here at the pub from 7 until closing on Christmas Eve. Dougie can confirm it, and half the village besides." So Angus was out. Fiona's alibi was weak but possible. Callum's could be verified. And Morag had means, motive, opportunity, and access to the exact poison used. But Hamish's instincts told him he was still missing something. The pieces fit too neatly, and in his experience real life was never that tidy. He returned to the station to find Jimmy Anderson had left a message. Morag Sutherland had no criminal record, no obvious connection to the Fraser case, and her husband had indeed died 5 years ago in Edinburgh. But there was one interesting note. Morag's maiden name was Lennox. Hamish sat back, feeling the case shift and settle into focus. Morag Lennox, married name Sutherland, sister to Donald Lennox, who died in prison thanks to Margaret Fraser's testimony. The helpful neighbour had been playing a very long game indeed. Chapter 6. False trails in the snow. Blair arrived from Strathbane like a bad smell carried on the wind, his face purple with irritation and his breath reeking of last night's whisky. He descended on the police station with Detective Constable Andy McNabb in tow, looking as if he had been dragged from a warm bed against his will. "Murder, is it?" Blair bellowed, helping himself to Hamish's chair without invitation. "In your wee village? Well, don't just stand there gawping, Macbeth. What have you got?" Hamish outlined the case carefully, watching Blair's expression shift from irritation to interest as the complexities emerged. When he mentioned the sleeping pills and Morag's maiden name, Blair's eyes gleamed with predatory satisfaction. "Open and shut, then. The sister of the man who died in prison, living next door to the woman who put him there. Revenge served cold. Arrest her." "I'd like to verify a few more things first, sir." "Verify? Why?" Blair slammed his hand on the desk, making lugs jump. "What's to verify? She had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. That's the holy trinity of murder investigation, Macbeth. Or did they not teach you that at police college?" "They also taught me not to jump to conclusions," Hamish said mildly. "There are other suspects, and some details don't quite fit." Blair's face went from purple to crimson. "I'm not having you complicate a simple case just so you can play the Highland detective. I want an arrest by tonight, or I'll have someone else handle it." After Blair departed in a cloud of bluster and bad temper, Hamish sat down with his notes. He wanted Morag to be guilty. The evidence pointed that way, but something nagged at him. The woman he'd observed was careful, meticulous. Would she really keep the murder weapon in her kitchen cupboard, labelled with her real first name? He decided to verify Callum Fraser's alibi first. A call to the petrol station in Perth confirmed that a man matching Callum's description had filled up a rental car at 7:15 on Christmas Eve. The CCTV footage would take a few days to obtain, but the timing made it nearly impossible for him to have reached Loch Dubh before 9. Dr. Dalrymple had estimated time of death between 8 and midnight, but the concentration of the drug suggested Elspeth had consumed the poisoned sherry earlier rather than later in that window. If Callum had arrived at 9:30 as he claimed, Elspeth would likely have been unconscious or dead already. Hamish crossed Callum off his list, though not without some reluctance. The nephew's bitterness felt like it should mean something. Next, he drove to Inverness to pay Fiona Grant a visit. Her office was in a converted church hall, cheerful but shabby, with posters about financial literacy covering walls that could have used a coat of paint. Fiona herself looked tired, shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "I've been expecting you," she said, gesturing him to a chair across from her cluttered desk. "You want to know about the irregularities in our accounts? If you don't mind." She pulled out a file folder thick with papers. 6 months ago, one of our volunteers was found to have been embezzling. Small amounts, but over 2 years it added up to nearly £15,000. We reported it to the police, she was prosecuted, and we've been trying to rebuild our reputation ever since. Did Mrs. Cameron know about this? I told her everything. I felt she deserved honesty, especially given the size of her intended donation. Fiona's hands twisted together. She was remarkably understanding. She said everyone deserves a chance to make things right, that organisations were only as good as the people running them, and she believed I was one of the good ones. That must have been a relief. It was more than that. It was redemption. Fiona's eyes filled with tears. I've been working in charity for 20 years, and this embezzlement nearly destroyed everything I'd built. Mrs. Cameron's faith in me, her willingness to still support our cause, it meant the world. Hamish studied her carefully. Where were you really on Christmas Eve, Miss Grant? She met his gaze steadily. I was at home, as I said, but I wasn't alone. I was with someone I shouldn't have been with, a married man. We've been seeing each other for 6 months, and I'm not proud of it. I'll need his name. I know. She wrote it down on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. He'll confirm it, though it'll likely end his marriage. But I suppose that was coming anyway. Back in Loch Dubh, Hamish confirmed the alibi with a discreet phone call that left him feeling soiled. The man had been defensive and angry, but he'd admitted to being with Fiona that evening. Another suspect eliminated, though Hamish took no pleasure in it. That left Morag and Angus McPhee. He found Angus at the McLean's cottage, fixing a leaking pipe, and pulled him aside. "Tell me again about your argument with Mrs. Cameron." Angus looked bewildered. "What argument? I told you. We had a wee disagreement about paint colours. That's hardly murder material. Someone told me you were angry about not being paid." "Who told you that?" Angus's face flushed with indignation. "That's a damned lie. She paid me in full, in cash, the day I finished the job. I've got the receipt at home if you want to see it." "What about sleeping pills? Did she ever mention having trouble sleeping?" "Not to me. We barely spoke beyond what needed doing in the house. She wasn't unfriendly, just private." Angus wiped his hands on his overalls. "Look, Hamish, I didn't know the woman well, but I liked her well enough. She treated me fair and paid on time. That's more than I can say for some in this village." Later at the pub, Hamish confirmed with Dougie the barman that Angus had indeed been there from 7 until closing on Christmas Eve, buying rounds and celebrating a good week's work. Half the village had witnessed it. So that was that. Every lead except Morag had dissolved like snow in sunlight. Hamish sat at the bar, nursing a whiskey and trying to ignore the growing certainty in his gut. The evidence pointed to Morag Sutherland, but something still felt wrong. He thought about her tears, her genuine distress, the way she'd looked after Elspeth with what had seemed like real affection. Could someone maintain such a performance for 6 months? Could they bring meals and make conversation and sit by the fire with someone they planned to murder, all while smiling and pretending to care? "You look like a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders," Dougie observed, polishing a glass. Just thinking about human nature, Hamish said. About how far people will go for revenge. Oh, well, revenge is a powerful thing in the Highlands. Long memories we have, and longer grudges. Dougie set down his glass. But sometimes what looks like revenge is just sadness turned inside out. Hamish looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean, I've seen Morag Sutherland these past months, watching her with Mrs. Cameron. And if that was hatred, I'm the King of Scotland. That woman cared about her neighbour, whatever you might think. People can fake caring. Aye, for a day or a week, not for 6 months, not the way Morag did. Dougie leaned on the bar. I'm not saying she didn't do it, mind. I'm just saying if she did, it wasn't simple revenge. Nothing's ever simple when it comes to the human heart. Walking back to the station through the damp evening, lugs padding beside him, Hamish turned Dougie's words over in his mind. What if Morag had tracked Elspeth down intending revenge, but then found herself unable to go through with it? What if those months of care had been real, an unexpected bond forming despite the history between them, and then something had changed? Elspeth had decided to confess, to make her past public, to donate her money to help fraud victims. That would bring it all back, wouldn't it? The trial, the testimony, Donald Lennox's imprisonment and death. It would make Elspeth the hero of her own redemption story, while Donald remained the villain. Perhaps that had been too much for Morag to bear. Or perhaps, Hamish thought with a sudden chill, he was still missing something crucial. He let himself into the station and pulled out the file on the Fraser fraud case again, reading through every detail. The names of the accused, the charges, the sentences. Donald Lennox, 12 years. James McAllister, 10 years. Robert Grant, 8 years. Thomas Kerr, 7 years. Andrew Morrison, 5 years. Morrison. Something about that name tugged at his memory. He pulled out the photograph from Elspeth's suitcase, the one of her with the younger man, turned it over and read the faded inscription again. M. and James, Loch Lomond, 1978. James. James McAllister. Not her husband, her lover. And if James McAllister had been one of the men she'd testified against, then perhaps Elspeth's guilt ran deeper than anyone had realised. Hamish reached for the phone to call Jimmy Anderson, a new theory forming in his mind. This case had more layers than a Highland mist, and he was determined to see through every single one of them. Chapter 7. The Helpful Neighbour. Jimmy Anderson called back within the hour, his voice crackling over the line from Glasgow. James McAllister died 3 years ago, Hamish. Cancer. He served his full 10 years, got out, tried to rebuild his life, but it never really took. Died alone in a bedsit in Maryhill. Any family? None listed. But here's something interesting. According to prison records, he had one regular visitor during his sentence, a woman named Margaret Fraser. Hamish felt the pieces shifting again. She visited the man she'd testified against? Aye. Every month for the first 5 years, then it stopped. Prison staff remember her, said she always looked devastated when she left. Jimmy paused. There's more. McAllister left everything he owned to an E. Cameron of Loch Dubh. It wasn't much, just a few £1,000s and some personal effects. The solicitor tried to contact her, but never got a response. After hanging up, Hamish sat in the darkness of the station, Lug snoring at his feet. The picture was becoming clearer and more tragic. Margaret Fraser had been in love with James McAllister. She'd been caught up in the fraud scheme, probably not understanding the full extent of what was happening. When it all collapsed, she'd testified to save herself, sending the man she loved to prison. And then she'd spent 5 years trying to make amends through visits, watching him waste away in a cell because of her words. When he'd rebuffed her, or perhaps when the guilt became too much, she'd stopped. Changed her name, disappeared, tried to build a new life. But guilt had followed her to Loch Dubh. Hence the planned donation, the decision to confess, the attempt at redemption, even though James was long dead. The question remained, who had killed her for it? The next morning brought freezing rain that turned the village into a skating rink. Hamish made his way carefully to Morag's cottage, his mind full of questions that needed answers. She opened the door, looking pale and drawn, as if she hadn't slept. "I wondered when you'd come back," she said quietly. "You'd better come in." The cottage was warm, the fire burning cheerfully, but the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken things. Morag poured tea with hands that trembled slightly. "You know, don't you," she said, "about Donald, about who I really am." "Moira Lennox," Hamish said gently, "sister to Donald Lennox, who died in prison." She nodded, settling into her chair as if the weight of carrying the secret had finally become too much. "I thought I was so clever, using my middle name with the doctor, keeping just enough of my real identity that I wouldn't forget who I was, but not clever enough, apparently." "How long have you known who Elspeth really was?" 3 years, almost from the moment she arrived in Lochdub." Morag stared into her teacup. "I'd moved here to get away from Glasgow, from the memories. My husband had died. I needed a fresh start. And then one day, I'm walking past Patel's and I see her. Older, greyer, but I'd know that face anywhere. Margaret Fraser, the woman who destroyed my family." "So you befriended her?" "Not right away. At first I just watched. Tried to understand what kind of person could do what she'd done, and then live quietly in a pretty Highland village as if none of it had happened." Morag's voice was bitter. "I hated her. I wanted her to suffer the way Donald suffered, the way I suffered when they told me he was dead." "What changed?" "She was lonely. Desperately, achingly lonely." Morag looked up, her eyes bright with tears. "I'd see her at the shops, always alone, always with this sadness hanging over her like a cloud. And one day I thought, this is it. This is my revenge. I'll become her friend. I'll make her trust me, depend on me. And then I'll tell her who I really am and watch her world fall apart." Hamish said nothing, letting her talk. So I started bringing her food, checking on her, being the concerned neighbour. It was all an act. At first, every smile was a lie. Every kind word had poison underneath. Morag's hands clenched around her cup. But then something happened. She started to open up to me, just little things. She'd mentioned how she couldn't sleep sometimes, how she saw faces in her dreams, how she had done terrible things in her past that she couldn't undo. "She confessed to you." "Not directly. She never said what she'd done, but I could see the guilt eating at her. It was destroying her from the inside, Hamish. She wasn't getting away with anything. She was serving her own prison sentence, had been for 30 years. And you started to feel sorry for her." "God help me, yes." Morag wiped at her eyes. "I didn't want to. I fought it. I'd remind myself of Donald dying in that cell, of my mother's grief. But Elspeth wasn't the villain I'd built up in my mind. She was just a frightened, broken woman trying to live with what she'd done." "Did you kill her, Morag?" She looked at him directly, her face crumpling. "I don't know." The words hung in the air, impossible and terrible. "What do you mean you don't know?" "The night she died, I brought her supper as usual. We talked. She seemed agitated, said she'd made a decision about something important. She asked me if I believed people could be forgiven for unforgivable things." Morag's voice broke, and I said yes, because by then I meant it. I'd forgiven her, Hamish. Somewhere along the way, I'd let go of the hate. "Go on." She poured herself a sherry while we talked. I didn't touch it, didn't prepare it. She said she had letters to write, things to settle, and she wanted to be alone. So I left around 6, went home, took 2 of my sleeping pills because I'd been having trouble sleeping myself, and went to bed. 2 pills? Yes, I know what you're thinking. The bottle had more pills in it before. I used to take them regularly after my husband died, but I'd weaned myself off. There should have been around 30 left, but when you asked me to count, there were only 15. Hamish leaned forward. "Someone took half your pills. Or I'm going mad and took them myself without remembering. Or I'm lying to you now to cover up murder." Morag laughed, a sound devoid of humour. I've been going over it in my mind for days. I had the means, the motive, the opportunity. Maybe I did kill her. Maybe I'm the monster Donald always said I was for not standing by him. Donald said that. Before he died, he blamed me for not visiting him in prison, for moving on with my life instead of waiting for him. He said I was as much a traitor as Margaret Fraser. She met Hamish's eyes. Maybe he was right. Hamish sat back, studying her. The confession, if that's what it was, had the ring of truth, but it was also perfectly calculated to make her seem sympathetic, to cast doubt on her own guilt while explaining away the evidence. Who else had access to your pills? Anyone, really. I don't lock my door during the day. Half the village has been in and out over the years. She shook her head. But who else would want Elspeth dead? Who else even knew who she really was? That was the question, wasn't it? Hamish stood, his mind racing through possibilities. Don't leave Lochdub, he said. I'm not arresting you yet, but I need you to stay available. Walking back through the freezing rain, Hamish felt the case slipping through his fingers like water. Morag's story made sense, but so did the theory that she was simply a very good liar. The missing pills could have been taken by anyone, or by no one if Morag was lying about the count. Back at the station, he made a list of everyone who'd visited Morag's cottage in the past 6 months. It was a long list. Lochdub was that kind of village, where neighbours dropped in for tea and chat, where doors were left unlocked and privacy was a flexible concept. But there was one name that kept circling back to him. One person who'd had reason to visit Morag regularly, who'd known both women, who might have had access to the pills. He reached for the phone, a new theory forming that was so dark, so twisted, that he almost didn't want to pursue it. But murder was never simple in the Highlands, and the truth had a way of hiding in the most unlikely places. Chapter 8. Buried Truths. Hamish spent the rest of the morning chasing a thread so fine it might have been his imagination. He started with the electoral register, then moved to land registry records, council tax payments, and every other official document he could access without raising Blair's suspicions. What he found made him reach for the phone. Jimmy, I need you to dig deeper into the Fraser case. Specifically, I need to know if any of the convicted men had family connections to this area. Children, cousins, anyone who might have ties to the Highlands. That's a tall order, Hamish. We're talking 30 years ago. I know, but something's not adding up, and I think the answer's buried in the past. While he waited, Hamish walked down to the harbour, Lugs trotting beside him with his usual air of philosophical resignation. The rain had stopped, leaving the village washed clean and gleaming in weak winter sunlight. He stood looking at Elspeth's cottage, dark and silent, and at Morag's next door, where a thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney. 2 women, both carrying secrets, both damaged by the same events 3 decades past. Had they finally found peace together, or had the past reached out and destroyed them both? His mobile rang. Jimmy sounding excited. You were right to dig, Hamish. Thomas Kerr, one of the convicted men, had a sister living in Ullapool. Name of Helen Kerr, married a fisherman, named Stuart Morrison. They had a daughter. Morrison, Hamish breathed. Andrew Morrison was one of the convicted men. Aye, but no relation that I can find. Just a coincidence. Jimmy paused. The daughter's name was Morag Morrison. She married young, took her husband's name, became Morag Sutherland. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Are you telling me Morag Sutherland is related to Thomas Kerr, not Donald Lennox? Niece by marriage through her mother. But here's where it gets interesting. Donald Lennox and Thomas Kerr were best friends, practically brothers. When Lennox died in prison, Kerr took it hard and wrote letters to anyone who'd listen, claiming Margaret Fraser had murdered his friend as surely as if she'd stabbed him herself. Hamish thanked Jimmy and rang off, his mind reeling. Morag had lied about being Donald Lennox's sister. But why? Unless the truth was even more complicated than she'd admitted. He found her in her garden, deadheading roses that had long since finished blooming, the kind of futile task people do when they need to keep their hands busy. "You're not Donald Lennox's sister," he said without preamble. She didn't look surprised, just tired. "No, I wondered if you'd discover that. You're Thomas Kerr's niece." "Through my mother, yes. I barely knew him. My parents moved to Ullapool when I was small, wanted nothing to do with the Glasgow relatives and their schemes." She set down her secateurs. "I didn't even know about the fraud case until I was older, until my uncle came to visit after he got out of prison." "When was this?" "About 20 years ago. He was broken, Hamish. Prison had destroyed him, but he wasn't bitter about his own sentence. He was consumed with rage about Donald Lennox dying in there." Morag's voice grew soft. "He told me about Margaret Fraser, about her testimony, about how she had betrayed men who trusted her. He made me promise that if I ever had the chance, I'd make her pay." "So you tracked her down?" "Not right away. My uncle died a few years later, and I got married, had a life. But when my husband passed and I was looking for a fresh start, I remembered the promise. I hired a private investigator, found out Margaret Fraser had become Elspeth Cameron, and that she was living in Loch-Dubh." Morag met his gaze. "I moved here to fulfill a deathbed promise to a man I barely knew. How's that for stupidity?" "Why did you tell me you were Donald Lennox's sister?" "Because it sounded more direct, more personal. I thought you'd understand revenge for a brother better than revenge for an uncle's friend." She laughed bitterly. "And maybe because I'd been living the lie for so long. I told everyone my husband was the Sutherland, but his name was Morrison, same as one of the convicted men. I thought changing my name would distance me from it all, but it just made the web more tangled." Hamish studied her carefully. "Did your uncle ever mention anyone else who might have wanted revenge on Margaret Fraser? Anyone else who made promises?" Morag frowned. "He talked about Donald Lennox's widow sometimes. Moira, her name was. Said she disappeared after the trial, cut all ties with everyone. He thought maybe she'd gone abroad." "Did he say anything else about her?" "Just that she was devoted to Donald, that his death had broken something in her." "Why?" But Hamish was already moving, pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. He'd been so focused on Morag's connection to the case that he'd missed another possibility entirely. Back at the station, he pulled out his notes on everyone who'd had contact with both Elspeth and Morag in the past 6 months. One name appeared with startling frequency, someone who'd visited Morag regularly, who'd known both women, who'd had the opportunity to take those pills. Angela Brodie, the doctor's wife. Angela, who'd mentioned recognising Elspeth from an old newspaper photograph. Angela, who'd tried to get Elspeth involved in village activities and been rebuffed. Angela, who brought her meals to half the village and was known for her kindness. Angela, whose maiden name he had never thought to check. He called Jimmy again. "I need you to find out everything you can about Angela Brodie, currently living in Loch-Dubh. Maiden name, previous addresses, any connection to the Fraser fraud case." 20 minutes later, Jimmy called back, his voice grim. "Angela Brodie's maiden name is Lennox. Angela Moira Lennox. She's Donald Lennox's widow, Hamish. She remarried 10 years ago to Dr. Thor Brodie and moved to Loch-Dubh 8 years back." Hamish felt cold settle over him. Angela had been here for 8 years, living quietly, being the perfect doctor's wife. And then 3 years ago, Elspeth had arrived, and Angela had recognised her. Had she known immediately, or had it taken time? Either way, she'd waited, watched, and planned. And when Morag had befriended Elspeth, creating the perfect cover, Angela had seized her opportunity. He drove to the Brodie house, his mind racing through the implications. Dr. Brodie was away at a conference, wouldn't be back until tomorrow. Angela was alone. She answered the door with her usual warm smile, but it faltered when she saw his expression. "Hamish, is something wrong?" "I need to talk to you about Elspeth Cameron, Mrs. Brodie. Or should I say, Mrs. Lennox?" The smile disappeared entirely. For a long moment they stood in silence. Then Angela stepped back, opening the door wider. "You'd better come in." The house was immaculate, everything in its place, much like Elspeth's cottage had been. Angela led him to the sitting room and sat with her hands folded in her lap, the picture of composure. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Not long enough. I was too focused on Morag Sutherland." "Poor Morag. I suppose you've put her through hell, suspecting her." Angela's voice was sad. "She didn't kill Elspeth, you know. She'd grown to care about her, despite everything. I could see it happening, watched it with fascination. How do you forgive someone who destroyed your life? Morag found a way. But you didn't. No." Angela's hands tightened. "I couldn't. Donald was everything to me, and she took him away. 5 years I visited him in that prison, watching him diminish, watching the light go out of his eyes, and all because Margaret Fraser decided to save herself." "So you killed her?" "I ensured she faced justice." Angela's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "When she arrived in Loughdub, I recognised her immediately. I've spent 30 years looking at that face in my nightmares, but I waited, Hamish. I wanted to understand what kind of person could do what she'd done, and then live peacefully in a place like this." "And what did you discover?" "That she was dying inside, that guilt was eating her alive, that she was planning some grand gesture of atonement that would make her the hero of her own tragic story." Angela's face hardened. "I couldn't allow that. She didn't deserve redemption." "So you took Morag's sleeping pills?" "It was simple, really. Morag leaves her door unlocked, and I visit often enough that no one would think twice about seeing me there. I took half the bottle over several weeks, crushing them into powder." Angela spoke as if describing a recipe. "On Christmas Eve, I told Elspeth I wanted to apologise for pressuring her about the committee work. I brought wine, a peace offering. She was touched, invited me in. While she was in the kitchen getting glasses, I stirred the powder into her sherry decanter. And then you left. And then I left. I knew her ritual, knew she'd pour herself a glass before bed. The dose was high enough that she'd simply drift off, peaceful, and she was quiet, the way Donald never got to go." Angela looked at him with eyes that held no remorse. She died thinking she was about to make everything right. That's more mercy than she deserved. Hamish stood, feeling the weight of what came next. "Angela Brodie, I'm arresting you for the murder of Elspeth Cameron." She nodded, as if she'd been expecting this all along. "I suppose I should call my solicitor, though I doubt he'll have much to work with. I've told you everything, and I'd tell a jury the same." "Why? Why confess so easily?" Angela smiled, and it was the saddest thing Hamish had ever seen. "'Cause I'm tired, Hamish. I've been carrying Donald's death for 25 years, and I'm tired. At least now it's done." As he led her out to the police car, Hamish saw Morag standing in her garden, watching. Their eyes met across the distance, two women who'd both sought revenge and found only emptiness. Justice, Hamish thought, was a cold comfort in the Highlands. Chapter 9. The Widow's Secret. The interview room at Strathbane Police Headquarters was painted a dispiriting shade of green that seemed designed to leech hope from even the most optimistic soul. Angela Brodie sat across from Hamish with her solicitor beside her, a nervous young man named Petrie, who kept adjusting his glasses and looking as if he wished he were anywhere else. Blair paced behind Hamish like a restless bull, occasionally interjecting questions that revealed he'd understood perhaps a third of the case. "Let's go through it again," Hamish said gently. "You recognised Elspeth Cameron when she arrived in Loughdub 3 years ago?" "Yes, I'd know her face anywhere. I used to sit in the courtroom gallery during the trial, watching her testify." Angela's voice was steady, almost serene. "She was 38 then, younger than I am now, but already you could see the guilt in her eyes. I remember thinking she deserved to feel guilty." "But you didn't confront her." "What would have been the point? She had served her sentence, such as it was. Confronting her wouldn't bring Donald back." Angela folded her hands on the table. "Besides, I was curious. I wanted to see what kind of life Margaret Fraser had built on the ruins of ours." "And what did you discover?" "That she was punishing herself more effectively than I ever could. She lived like a ghost, Hamish. No friends, no joy, just existing from one day to the next. Angela's expression softened slightly. There were times I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. What changed? Why kill her now after 3 years? Angela was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain. 2 months ago, she came to me. Said she wanted to talk to someone who might understand. She didn't know who I really was, of course. To her, I was just Angela Brodie, the kindly doctor's wife who organised fetes and baked for church sales. What did she want to talk about? Forgiveness? Redemption? She said she was planning to make a public confession, to tell the truth about what had happened 30 years ago. She wanted to donate her money to help victims of fraud, to try to balance the scales. Angela's hands clenched. She talked about James McAllister, about how she'd loved him, how testifying against him had destroyed her. She actually cried, Hamish. Sat in my kitchen and cried about the man she'd sent to prison. That must have been difficult to hear. Difficult, Angela laughed, a brittle sound. It was obscene. She was turning herself into a tragic heroine, the woman who'd sacrificed everything for love and justice. There was no mention of the wives left behind, the children who grew up without fathers, the families destroyed. It was all about her pain, her guilt, her redemption. Blair slammed his hand on the table. So you decided to play God, is that it? I decided to administer justice, Angela said calmly. The courts had failed. She'd walked away with a suspended sentence while good men rotted in prison. While my Donald died behind bars. Donald Lennox was convicted of fraud, Hamish pointed out. He wasn't innocent. He was no worse than 100 other developers in Glasgow at the time. The scheme was risky, yes, but it wasn't criminal. Not really. Angela's composure cracked slightly. Margaret Fraser made it seem worse than it was, exaggerated the deception, painted them all as monsters to save her own skin, and the prosecutors believed her because she was pretty and articulate and knew how to play the victim. Tell me about Christmas Eve, Hamish said. Walk me through exactly what you did. Angela took a breath, settling back into her calm recitation. I went to see her around 5 in the afternoon, brought a bottle of wine, said I wanted to apologise for being pushy about the committee work. She was pleased, invited me in. While she was fetching glasses, I poured the crushed sleeping pills into her sherry decanter. It only took a moment. How much did you put in? All of it. 15 pills ground to powder. I tested it at home first, made sure it would dissolve completely, leave no trace. She spoke as if describing a recipe. We had a glass of wine together, talked about nothing important. I left around 6, wished her a happy Christmas, and went home to make dinner for my husband. Didn't you worry the pills might not work? I'd researched it thoroughly. With her age, her body weight, the alcohol in her system, the dose was more than sufficient. I knew she'd drink her usual sherry before bed. It was her ritual, her way of relaxing. Angela met Hamish's eyes. She died peacefully. Probably didn't even realise what was happening. That's more kindness than Donald received. What about Morag Sutherland? You let her take the blame. I didn't let her do anything. She made her own choices, befriending Elspeth despite knowing who she was. Angela's voice hardened. Though I'll admit, when I realised she was connected to the case, it made my plan easier. The pills came from her house after all. If anyone was caught, it would be her. Petrie, the solicitor, finally found his voice. Mrs. Brodie, I must advise you to stop talking. You're making this very difficult for me to defend. I don't want a defence, Angela said simply. I did what I did, and I'd do it again. The only thing I regret is that she never knew who killed her or why. I should have told her, let her understand in those final moments that justice had finally caught up with her. After the interview, Hamish stood outside the station, breathing in the cold Strathbane air and wishing he were back in Loch-Dubh. Blair had taken Angela away to be processed, crowing about solving the case as if he had done anything more than shout and bluster. His mobile rang. Dr. Brodie, his voice shaken and disbelieving. Hamish, they're saying Angela killed someone. That can't be right. She's the gentlest person I know. I'm sorry, Doctor, but it's true. She's confessed to everything. But why? Why would she? The doctor's voice trailed off. She never told me about her first husband. I knew she'd been married before, that he'd died, but she always changed the subject when I asked. I thought she was just private about her grief. She was protecting you from a past you wanted to forget. And now she's thrown her life away for revenge against a woman I barely knew. Brody sounded lost. How did I not see this? How did I not know my own wife was capable of murder? People are good at hiding what they don't want seen, Hamish said, thinking of Elspeth, of Morag, of all the secrets that had festered in Loch Dubh, even from those closest to them. He drove back to Loch Dubh as dusk fell, lugs beside him in the passenger seat. The village looked peaceful in the gathering darkness, lights twinkling from windows, smoke rising from chimneys. It was hard to believe that beneath this tranquil surface 3 women's lives had collided in tragedy. Morag was waiting at the police station when he arrived, her face pale and strained. Is it true? Angela was Donald's wife. Aye. All this time she was right here, living next door, bringing me casseroles, chatting about the weather. Morag sank into a chair. She must have hated me, knowing what I was planning. I don't think she hated you. I think she saw you as irrelevant to her purpose. That's almost worse. Morag looked up at him. What happens now? You're free to go. You were never officially under arrest. I meant what happens to Angela. She'll stand trial. With her confession, it's an open and shut case. She'll spend the rest of her life in prison. Morag was quiet for a long moment. 3 lives destroyed by what happened 30 years ago. 4, if you count James McAllister. When does it end, Hamish? When does the past finally let go? I don't know, he admitted. In the Highlands, we have long memories. Sometimes I think we hold on to grudges because they're all we have left of the people we've lost. Is that what I was doing? Holding on to my uncle's grudge because it made me feel connected to family? Maybe. Or maybe you were looking for purpose after your husband died. Either way, you let it go in the end. That counts for something. After Morag left, Hamish sat alone in the station, thinking about Elspeth Cameron and her desperate attempt at redemption. She'd spent 30 years running from her past, and when she'd finally decided to face it, the past had killed her. There was a lesson in there somewhere, he thought, about the price of betrayal, about the weight of guilt, about how revenge poisoned everyone it touched. But on this cold Highland evening, all Hamish felt was sadness for the waste of it all. 3 women, each shaped by the same event in different ways. Margaret Fraser, who'd betrayed the man she loved to save herself. Moira Lennox, who'd loved her husband enough to spend decades planning revenge. And Morag Morrison, who'd promised a dying man she'd make his enemies pay. In the end, none of them had found what they were seeking. Elspeth had died before she could atone. Angela had achieved her revenge only to lose everything. And Morag was left with the bitter knowledge that forgiveness had come too late. Hamish locked up the station and walked home through the quiet village, lugs at his heels. Tomorrow he'd file his reports, face Blair's attempts to take credit, and begin the process of moving on. But tonight, he'd sit by his fire and be grateful for the simple life he'd chosen. A life without grand passions or terrible betrayals. A life where the worst he had to deal with was poaching and the occasional drunk driver. It might not be glamorous, but it was honest. And into the Highlands, where secrets had a way of destroying lives, honesty was worth more than gold. Chapter 10. A Quiet Highland Justice. The snow returned to Loch Dubh on Hogmanay, falling soft and silent as if trying to blanket the village's recent troubles under fresh white innocence. Hamish stood at his window watching it accumulate, lugs pressed against his leg in companionable silence. A week had passed since Angela Brodie's arrest. The village had reacted with the kind of shocked disbelief that came from discovering a serpent in the garden. Angela, who'd organised their fetes and baked their cakes, who'd seemed the very embodiment of Highland kindness, had coldly plotted murder for months. Dr. Brodie had left Lockdube 3 days ago, unable to face the questions and the gossip. Hamish didn't blame him. The poor man had looked 10 years older, bewildered by the revelation that his wife had been living a lie throughout their marriage. The case had made the newspapers, of course. Highland murder, widow's 30-year revenge, screamed the headlines. Journalists had descended on Lockdube like gulls on fish scraps, pestering anyone who'd talk. The Curry sisters had been in their element, giving interviews that bore only a passing resemblance to truth. Jessie claimed she'd suspected Angela all along, while Nessie nodded and repeated everything a beat behind. Blair had taken credit for solving the case, naturally. His press conference in Strathbane had been a masterpiece of self-aggrandisement, with barely a mention of Hamish's role. Hamish had watched it on television and felt only relief. The less attention he attracted, the less likely Strathbane was to promote him away from Lockdub. The telephone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Jimmy Anderson. "Thought you'd want to know, Hamish. Angela Brodie's pleading guilty. Her solicitor tried to talk her out of it, but she's insisting, said she wants it over with." No surprise there. She was never going to deny it. Well, the judge will take the guilty plea into account, but with premeditation this clear, she's looking at life. Probably serve at least 15 years before parole. Jimmy paused. There's something else. Elspeth Cameron's will has been processed. She left everything to that charity, just as she'd planned. £50,000 and the cottage. Fiona Grant says they're going to use it to set up a fund for families affected by financial fraud. That's something, at least. Margaret Fraser gets her a redemption after all, even if she's not alive to see it. Jimmy's voice grew thoughtful, and makes you wonder if it was worth it, doesn't it? All that money going to help people, but she had to die for it to happen. After hanging up, Hamish pulled on his coat and walked down to the harbour. The snow had transformed Lockdube into a Christmas card scene, all white roofs and frosted trees. Children were building a snowman near the war memorial, their laughter carrying clear in the cold air. He found Morag Sutherland at Elspeth's cottage, standing outside and staring at the darkened windows. "They're putting it up for sale," she said without turning around. "The charity wants to liquidate all the assets quickly. Can't say I blame them. How are you managing?" "Better than I deserve." She finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I've been thinking about what you said, about holding on to grudges because they're all we have left. You were right. After my husband died, I had nothing, no children, no close family, just emptiness. The promise to my uncle gave me purpose, even if it was a dark one. And now? Now I have to find a different purpose." Morag managed a weak smile. "I have been talking to Fiona Grant. She needs someone to help run the new fund, someone who understands what fraud does to families. I thought I might volunteer." "That's good of you." "It's penance, really. I didn't kill Elspeth, but I thought about it often enough. Maybe helping the charity she wanted to support will balance the scales a bit." She turned to face the cottage fully. "I did care about her in the end, you know. That wasn't a lie. She was lonely and sad and trying so hard to be good. We could have been friends if the past hadn't been sitting between us like a stone." "The past has a way of doing that in the Highlands." "Aye, it does." Morag pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "Will you be at the Saley tonight? It's Hogmanay. The village needs some cheer after everything that's happened." "I'll be there," Hamish promised. She walked away through the snow, leaving him standing before Elspeth's cottage. He thought about the woman who'd lived there, carrying her guilt like a cross for 30 years. Had she found any peace in those final weeks, planning her confession and her donation? Or had the weight of James McAllister's death in prison, of the families she'd helped destroy, been too heavy to ever put down? He'd never know. The dead kept their secrets. That evening, the village hall filled with people determined to see out the old year and welcome the new with proper Highland spirit. Dougie had brought whiskey, several bottles of it. Mrs. Wellington had organised the food. a spread of savouries and sweets that groaned on trestle tables. The musicians were tuning up in the corner, preparing to play reels and jigs until dawn. Hamish arrived to find the place already crowded and loud with conversation. People greeted him with the careful friendliness reserved for those who'd recently been involved in unpleasant business. The murder had touched everyone, but there was a collective determination to move past it. He spotted Morag talking with Fiona Grant in one corner, their heads bent together over what looked like paperwork. Callum Fraser stood awkwardly by the drinks table, looking as if he wasn't quite sure why he'd stayed in Lockdube, but wasn't quite ready to leave either. Archie McLean clapped Hamish on the shoulder, his breath already heavy with whiskey fumes. "Hell of a thing, Hamish, hell of a thing. Who'd have thought Angela Brodie had it in her?" "People can surprise you," Hamish said diplomatically. "Aye, they can at that. Still, it's a sad business all around. 2 women dead or ruined, all over things that happened before some of these young folk were even born." Archie shook his head. "The Highlands remember too much, if you ask me." The music started, a lively reel that had people moving to the dance floor despite their sombre moods. Hamish watched them whirl and spin, the old and young together, and felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. This was what villages did. They absorbed tragedy, processed it, and moved forward because there was no other choice. Come spring, new people would move into Elspeth's cottage. Dr. Brodie's practice would get a new doctor. Angela would become a cautionary tale told in whispers, and life would continue its inexorable march forward. Jessie Curry descended on him with her sister in tow, both wearing festive hats that made them look like elderly Christmas crackers. "Such excitement we've had, Hamish," Jessie said, her eyes gleaming. "Though terrible, of course, terrible, terrible," Nessie echoed dutifully. "I always knew there was something off about Angela Brodie," Jessie continued, conveniently forgetting her previous interviews praising Angela's kindness. "Too perfect, if you ask me. Nobody's that helpful without an ulterior motive." "Ulterior motive," Nessie confirmed. Hamish excused himself before Jessie could rewrite more history, and made his way to where Callum Fraser stood nursing a whisky and looking uncomfortable. "Decided to stay for Hogmanay?" Hamish asked. "Seemed wrong to leave before seeing the year out. Besides, I've been thinking." Callum stared into his glass. "My aunt, Elspeth, Margaret, whatever you want to call her. She was trying to make amends at the end. That counts for something." "Aye, it does. And I've spent so long being angry at her that I forgot my father made his own choices. He committed fraud, went to prison for it. Margaret's testimony didn't help, but it wasn't her fault he broke the law in the first place." Callum looked up, his eyes clearer than Hamish had seen them. "I think I'll take my share of whatever's left after the charity gets its portion. Use it to do something good. Maybe that's what my father would have wanted, if he had lived long enough to find perspective." As midnight approached, the whole village gathered, counting down the final seconds of the year. When the clock struck 12, the hall erupted in cheers and singing, everyone joining hands for Auld Lang Syne. Hamish stood in the circle, holding hands with Morag on one side and Archie on the other, and felt the peculiar mix of melancholy and hope that Hogmanay always brought. Another year ending, another beginning. The dead buried, the living moving forward. He thought of Elspeth Cameron, who'd spent 3 decades running from her past only to be caught by it in the end. He thought of Angela Brodie, who'd let revenge consume her until there was nothing left but the cold satisfaction of a murder accomplished. And he thought of Morag Sutherland, who'd learned that some grudges weren't worth carrying. As the song ended and people moved to embrace and exchange good wishes, Hamish slipped outside for a breath of air. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear and full of stars. Loughdub lay peaceful beneath its white blanket, the loch dark and still beyond the village lights. Lugs appeared at his side, having escaped from the station where Hamish had left him. The dog leaned against his leg, and Hamish reached down to scratch his ears. "Happy New Year, boy," he said softly. Inside, the music started again, a slow air that drifted through the open door. Hamish stood listening to it, thinking about justice and redemption and the price of secrets. In the Highlands, the past was never truly past. It lingered in the stones and the water, in the memories passed down through generations. But perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Perhaps remembering even the painful things was what kept people honest. He stayed outside for a few more minutes, watching his breath mist in the cold air, then turned back toward the hall. There was whiskey to drink and neighbours to greet and a new year to welcome. The dead could rest now. The living had work to do. And in Lochdoub, under the vast Highland sky, life would go on as it always had, with all its secrets and sorrows and small stubborn joys.